welcome. My name is Beri Meric. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Alex Edmans today. Alex, welcome. How's it going?
Good, thanks. It's great to be here, Beri. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you, everybody who's dialed in today or subsequently listening to this recording. We're going to be talking about a very important topic. We're going to be figuring out how we can grow the pie by learning how great companies deliver both purpose and profit. Alex is truly the ultimate guide to this subject. He is a renowned London Business School professor of finance and a celebrated speaker from all variety of forums, ranging from Davos to TED and multiple other arenas. He is a leading authority specifically on reforming business to serve the common good. And his approach, unlike many others out there, is using solutions that are based on rigorous evidence that recognizes the importance also of investors as well as other stakeholders as well. He's been published in all the leading academic journals, written for the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, and so forth. And his latest book is called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Can Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, and what our subject is based on today. What I'd love everybody to think about before we dive in together with Alex is to reflect really keenly on what is your key intention for being here. What about the title of this talk and this subject matter got you here specifically? What's the change that you're looking to make? I'd really encourage you to crystallize that before we dive in. And hopefully, based on Alex's guidance, we're all going to be much more clearer on the next steps we can take to achieve what we're looking to achieve. So Alex, to get us started, my first question to you is, why did you specifically write this book and what's at stake here?
So I wrote this book to highlight the criticality of purpose for businesses, how purpose is not just an optional extra, but it is fundamental for a business to serve wider society. And importantly, I wanted to write about this topic as a finance professor, because often people think, well, purpose, that sounds a bit fluffy and wishy-washy. Is this just about a company being worthy? I wanted to show that the reason why a company needs to be purposeful is not just because we need a social license to operate, it's just good business. I wanted to show that actually businesses that do take their stakeholders seriously deliver more profit in the long term. And so this goes to the idea of growing the pie, which is the title of the book. So often we view companies as creating value. That value we think is a fixed pie. Anything that we give to society is at the expense of shareholders. So often to maximize profit, we want to exploit society by cutting wages or polluting the environment. But what I wanted to argue is actually, no, the pie can be grown. When we invest in our employees, when we invest in our communities, then actually companies become more profitable in the long term. And while that might sound like wishful thinking and too good to be true, I wanted to back this up with a lot of rigorous evidence, which is why I, as a professor, am coming to this really practical topic, is that based on research looking at hundreds of companies, this is not a pipe dream, but something realistic and achievable, and that every business leader should take this very seriously.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. Just to drill into that, one of my majors was economics. I really remember that, the curves and so on, and you're trying to capture value, and there always seems to be this trade-off. What you're sharing here is that as a finance professor, based on all your research, you're clear cut that the approach truly needs to be around growing the pie versus, increasing your share of value vis-a-vis your customers and society at large. Is that a black and white kind of clear conviction that you have, or does it also still depend on certain situations?
Yeah, so it does depend on certain situations, but let me first start with the thesis and then I'll get into the nuance. So what you've learned about in sort of basic economics classes, that is true in the short term. So it's a question of time horizon. So in the short term, the pie is indeed fixed, and automatically anything I pay to my workers will immediately come out of this quarter's profits. But what I'm looking at is, well, what happens in the long term? Well, you might think, well, In the long term, a company which can't keep its employee wages down will also be less profitable. But what I look at is 28 years of evidence suggesting that companies that treat their workers well actually do better in the long term because the workers are more productive, more motivated, and more likely to stay. And you might think, well, is it correlation or causation? Right? Is it that if you treat your workers well, you'll become more profitable? Or is it once you are profitable, you can start treating your workers well? But what I show it's the former is indeed employee satisfaction, which links to performance. So in the long term, the pie can be grown. But then let me go to the nuances. And so this is why I try not to be black and white. So unfortunately, a lot of talking heads like to be black and white but if you say something which is clear and with no nuance, it's something that gets tweeted and shared because it has a clear message. Here instead, what I want to highlight is that when we are to run purposeful businesses, we must also be discerning and we must also never lose sight of commercial realities. Right, so it doesn't mean that companies can just think about serving society, paying no attention to profits, because there are certain dimensions that are more material than others. For example, in most organizations, human capital is a key stakeholder, but other stakeholders, let's say the environment, yeah, I really personally care about climate change, but while the environment might be important in energy or extractives, it might not be important in other sectors. So let's say you're a bank, I would say the best way that you serve society might be through financial inclusion, through fair marketing and advertising, so we don't want to be in a Wells Fargo situation, rather than focusing on carbon footprint. And indeed, what the evidence suggests is it's not true that everything I do to serve stakeholders ultimately benefits profits, but what I do to my material stakeholders is key. So we don't want to be all things to all people. We want to be discerning in our approach.
Excellent. All right. So my key takeaways from what you just shared is one, while in the short term, the pie is what it is, and it seems like a zero-sum game, you're saying over a longer time frame, though, it's not like that because you can influence the size of the pie. You are saying that correlation versus causation, it is better to treat, for example, your employees better. It will lead to more profits if you do that consistently better versus the other way around, which is only if you're profitable, you can afford to do that. And finally, what you're saying is even despite all of this, it's still critical for a business to pick, okay, what's most important, like which stakeholders need to be prioritized, because you can't do all of them at the same time. Like that's I guess what I'm hearing from what you said.
That's absolutely right. And let's sort of drill down in that third point, because I think that's the one point which is often misunderstood. So if you look at, say, the Business Roundtable statement, which 181 CEOs signed last year, they said, well, our goal is to serve customers, employees, suppliers, the environment, investors. And that sounds great. That's being all things to all people, but it's unrealistic, right? Because you will face trade-offs where you're going to help some stakeholders and hurt others. So if I'm to shut down a polluting plant, that's good for the environment, but it's bad for employees. So if my goal is to serve both workers and the environment, I don't know how to make that decision. So it goes back to what it means to be a purposeful business. Like, we think the word purposeful means altruistic, but actually purposeful means focused and targeted, right? A purposeful meeting has a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So what a purposeful leader should do is to define, well, what are the main areas in which you will move the needle as a company? What are the most critical and material stakeholder issues? And actually realize, well, my goal is not to solve all of the world's problems. There's other issues here, but if they're not part of my expertise, then actually I can scale back on them.
Powerful distinction there, Alex. Thank you for that. So purposeful doesn't just mean you deeply care and that's it, but also that you're very intentional about exactly what you care about, and also, you know, not trying to, not being diluted across the board. Share with us, what are, like, other than the ones you've already shared, what are the key misconceptions and myths that people believe in, no matter how experienced they are at being an organizational leader or a policy expert? Like, what are the, you know, the key mistakes when it comes to like this, having the growing the pie mentality that you find people making over and over again?
Thanks. So I'll repeat two that I've already said, but let me just repeat them because I think they're key. So one of them is the fact that pie can be grown. So in the short term, the pie is fixed, but actually in the long term, things are different. So if you're indeed treating your material stakeholders well, this is not just fluffy, this is not just worthy, it's just good business. And the second is the recognition that actually, as a purposeful company, I am not responsible for solving all of the world's problems. So yes, the matters that are there in the world, they change from day to day. So it used to be, let's say, climate change, then the pandemic, now it might be Black Lives Matter. And sometimes as a leader, you might think, well, I should swing in the wind and respond to all of these social issues. And obviously you do need to be relevant and to focus on the issues of the day. But I think what's most important is for you to understand what are the issues that you can move the needle on most. So those 2 points I've already said, but let me introduce a third point, and let me look at this from the point of view of citizens or policymakers. So they often view that business is the enemy, shareholders are evil, and so if we are to repurpose business, let's try to shackle businesses through regulation. But that's also based on the pie splitting mentality. That is the idea that if I want to increase the pie which is given to society, I need to reduce the pie that's given to shareholders. And so we can heavily regulate businesses, ban share buybacks and dividends, heavily restrict CEO pay. And if you look at some of the big controversies, like Disney CEO Bob Iger, he was in huge trouble, I think it was last year, for being paid $60 million. That's a lot of money. But that was based on the pie splitting mentality. That was based on the idea that he was taking 60 million that could have been given to workers and so on. When actually, why was he paid so much? Because he'd grown the pie. He had created substantial value over the last 5 years. Disney's total shareholder return was 600%. When the S&P 500 was 140%. His company had created 70,000 jobs that wasn't at the expense of workers. And so therefore the second motivation for writing the book was not just to write it to business leaders, but also to write it to the general public who's really skeptical about business and is arguing for heavy regulation of business. But I think that will throw the baby out with the bathwater, because business, when properly repurposed, can be a massive force for good. And indeed, we've seen business solving a lot of the issues which are caused by the pandemic.
Excellent, Alex. Thank you so much. So taking that as a launching pad, those misconceptions, I'd love to dive into what you've formulated to be the key action items that businesses, and specifically business leaders, can take to operate with a growing the pie mentality. So if you could give us like a bird's eye view of what are the best ways in which business leaders can operate in a way that's in accordance with your key learnings, what would you say they are?
Yeah, so I'd say my first one, I'll go through these in a list and then we can go to each one in turn later. So one is to think about pie growing, not pie splitting. The second is to ask, what is in my hands? So what resources does my company have and how can I use them to serve society? The next one is to define my purpose in a focused and targeted way. Fourth is how to measure it. And the fifth is what to stop doing. So I'd say purpose is not only about knowing what to do as knowing what not to do. So if we have time, I'd be happy to go through all of them, but if not, we can just go through a couple.
All right, excellent. So let's start with the first one, pie growing versus pie splitting. So other than, just knowing that's important, like how do you actually day-to-day, meeting to meeting, strategic quarterly plan to another quarterly plan, like how do you actually infuse this as a business leader into all areas of your business in a practical way?
Yeah, so I think the importance of this pie growing versus pie splitting is to change what we view purpose as involving. So typically, we think a purposeful business is one that splits the pie fairly, right? So you make sure that you pay fair tax, not just the legal minimum. You pay fair wages, not just the minimum wage. You charge affordable prices to your customers, not what you can get away with charging. And obviously fairness is important, but what I want to do is elevate the conversation is that businesses must not just do no harm, but they must actively do good. So be relentlessly committed to excellence and innovation and think about how they can actively create value. So one example might be Vodafone, right? So what they did was they launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya, and that provided financial inclusion to millions of unbanked people. So had Vodafone not done that, there would have been no scandal, right? Because they wouldn't have been boycotted for mistreating workers or not paying taxes, but the value lost to society would be much, much higher. So I think one of the important things is for these conversations that business leaders can have is to think about how can they actively create value. And so I'm going to now link to actually my second point, which is the point of what's in your hand. So what I'm meaning by that question is to ask yourself as a leader, what resources and expertise does my company have? And how can I think creatively and wildly about how can I use them to serve society? So Vodafone in 2007, what was in their hand was mobile technology. Their key strategy at the time was to expand in the West, in the UK and the US, to win spectrum license auctions and to increase their market share. But they realized, well, actually, we can redeploy our technology expertise to allow mobile money to some people who've got no access to banking. And so that's, I think, the conversation that should be had. How can we use our expertise, think outside the box to redeploy what we're good at to solve some of the world's social problems?
Excellent. So is it correct to say what you're suggesting is above and beyond all the key strategies that a business has, you're suggesting that they should, if they don't already, they should have a strategic plan around the value that the business can create that doesn't necessarily immediately result in huge profits or things like that, but just do it because they have the resources, they have the ability. Vodafone can create M-Pesa, and or like, I'm just trying to understand like whether you're suggesting that like, how do you triangulate basically between like the projects that have this highest return on equity, return on investment, versus this return on purpose that might not have the profitability right there? Could you just help us navigate that a little bit?
Yeah, and that's a really important challenge because we still need to remain commercial. But I think that's based on the evidence that I have, is that if you are creating material value for your stakeholders, ultimately they come back and improve your profits, right? So Vodafone genuinely launched M-Pesa to solve a social problem using their expertise, but ultimately they were able to monetize it. But then that goes back to the ideas of being discerning and thinking about materiality, because if indeed what you're doing is you're leveraging your expertise, then you can achieve a huge impact on social value with quite small spending. So Vodafone spent only £1 million on M-Pesa in 2007, which even in 2007 money was tiny compared to its capex budget. Because what they were doing was linked to their core expertise, that £1 million of investment created far more than £1 million of social value, and therefore it came back and benefited Vodafone shareholder value in the long term. Now, that's importantly very different to what a lot of companies do in terms of their approach to purpose. They give loads of money to charity. There isn't that multiplicative aspect. If I give £1 million to charity, it's worth £1 million to charity. No more, no less. I'm not using my expertise. And so going back to, let's say, Black Lives Matter, so clearly I'm somebody who really cares about racial equality, but I think some of the responses that companies made might not have been moving the needle the most, right? They donated a lot of money to Black Lives Matter. Right, you might think, well, that's a great thing. Let me spend $5 million, but that's only worth $5 million to the charity. Instead, had they spent that $5 million into ensuring diversity within their hiring, making sure that their evaluation systems were not biased against certain minorities, and not just thinking about ethnic diversity, but also gender diversity, or were there certain practices where travel expectations meant that working mothers were not able to be valued as much, that would have had much more than $5 million of benefit. So you want to think about, how can I have the most impact with my limited resources? And if indeed that impact is only immediately to society, the fact that that ultimately does come back and benefit shareholder value is why you're going to get ultimately a return on the investment, if you make sure that your investments in society are linked to your comparative advantage.
Got it. And what's since you're a finance professor, I mean, what's a good rule of thumb in terms of how to think about what amount of capital to allocate on projects that are multiplicative, purpose-driven investments that really help the stakeholders, that don't have the same hurdle rate for other kinds of investments that the company might make in terms of short-term profitability? Like, how do you do the math around this? Would you say, I'm completely making this up, you know, you should spend of your investable capital, put 5% into, you know, stakeholder enhancing longer term projects, or do you still do the regular ROI calculation, but having a different hurdle rate for the things that have a longer horizon?
Thanks. So I actually suggest not having rules at all. So I know that finance professors love to have rules and they have a lot of faith in spreadsheets, but I would rather move from rules to principles. So we still need principles, right? So some advocates of responsible business sort of imply anything goes, that you should do anything that you can to serve society, but that's just basically not commercial, right? But what's the value of principles is that they work under uncertainty. So rules work in a textbook, and they work in academic theory, but they don't work in real life. So let's go back to perhaps the most famous finance rule, net present value analysis, right? Before making an investment, we try to think about what are the costs and benefits. So if I was to build a factory, I can think about how many widgets will that factory produce, how much I can sell them for. And obviously we know there's risk, but we know how to handle risk, right? We do some sensitivity analysis, we change the selling price of the widgets and so forth, and therefore we come up with a number. But in reality, right, there's uncertainty, and that means that you can't do NPV with some basic decisions where we have intangible assets. So what do I mean by an intangible asset? We're not building a machine, but we're investing in our people. So let's say now the decision is, let's give extended parental leave to our employees who have a child. Now, we've got some sense that maybe they'll be more motivated and productive, and maybe we'll hire better people, but there's no way we can put a number on that. And if we can't even put a number, there's nothing to do with sensitivity analysis around. So NPV, it sounds great, but just doesn't work in practice. So this is why I want to have principles. And in the book, I have 3 principles in chapter 3 to guide any leader. So the first is multiplication. And what I mean by that is a bit more like the social NPV is, does $1 invested in this stakeholder deliver more than $1 of benefit? And importantly, you don't need calculation to do that rule, right? You can immediately think about giving to charity. Well, that is not multiplicative because, well, $1 given to the charity is just worth $1. And that itself is striking because actually many companies think that purpose means philanthropy. The second is what I call comparative advantage, is that also $1 given to that company or given to that stakeholder must create more value than any other company could do with that. Because if not, you might pay higher prices to a supplier, and that supplier would have more money to serve society. So this is why Vodafone chose to focus on M-Pesa mobile money. It had a comparative advantage in telecommunications. And the third is materiality. So are the stakeholders that you're benefiting through this socially responsible activity material to your business? So often employees are really critical. Now for suppliers, for some companies, suppliers are critical. So Apple, right, in order to have the iPhone, right, they've got special glass which is made by Corning, their supplier. And so they have the Advanced Manufacturing Fund, which invests millions, hundreds of millions in their suppliers. But if you are a paints company where your suppliers supply generic chemicals, well, maybe suppliers are not so material to you. So this is again thinking about, well, if the stakeholder is material, then creating value for them will ultimately come back and benefit us in terms of profits.
Okay, excellent. I think that is a very powerful and unique framework to help think about how to do this. So what you're saying is there isn't some percentage rule of thumb of how much time or money you should spend on this. What you're saying is, given your priorities, given everything out there, if you're able, leveraging your existing resources to have a multiplier effect on the impact you can have, if you have a comparative advantage on making that impact, and if those stakeholders have a material impact on your business, then it's very smart to think about, like, what should we be doing because we can do it in a comparatively advantageous way. And it will, in the long run, also bring in, it will, in your estimation, based on the evidence you've seen, it will also impact the bottom line as well, in addition to having this positive benefit on the stakeholders.
Absolutely, you spark a virtuous circle. So if comparative advantage is satisfied, then I'm going to have a major impact on that stakeholder. And if materiality is satisfied, then that stakeholder will come back and materially affect and improve my business.
All right, excellent. So the third kind of point you had in terms of like the way that business leaders can have this grow to pie mentality operationalized. You said grow the pie in a targeted way. We already covered quite a bit on that. Is there anything else when it comes to doing this in a targeted way that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this goes back to the third point, was to define your purpose. And we've already talked about the idea that purpose must be focused and targeted. So a purpose to serve customers, employees, society, that doesn't mean anything because you're all things to all people. But I think, let me go a bit more specific. I would say that a purpose is only meaningful if the converse would be reasonable. So what I mean by this is a purpose should only tells you something if it rules out something else. So to say, I'm going to help customers, employees, environment, right, that means nothing because you would never help none of them. But if I was to be Costco and say my purpose is to provide quality goods and services at the lowest possible price, that is meaningful because the opposite would also be reasonable. You could also have a purpose to provide affordable goods and services at the highest possible quality. So by Costco highlighting that it's cost that trumps everything, that tells you something, right? It rules something else out. Otherwise, if you're not ruling anything out in your purpose statement, you're not giving any information as to what you stand for.
Excellent. I think I'd love to give everybody just a moment to digest that in your purpose statement, for your company, but maybe even in your life. What are you ruling out? Are you making sure to make it a statement that has that? I think that's powerful, Alex, and not often said. So really appreciate that. How would you recommend a company to specifically have a conversation on this? I mean, it seems like in the case of Costco, I mean, that's like literally the entire business model is predicated on that. What have you seen to be a powerful exercise for companies who are, it's a moving train? Like, how have you seen it based on the companies you've had experiences with, how they've course corrected on this? If they were too loose with their purpose, what's a good way for them to kind of define what they're not about?
Yeah, this is really good. And I think an important principle is for purpose to be not just deliberate, but also emergent. So what I mean by that is we often think that the leaders of a business can define in an ivory tower what the purpose is, and then employees just implement the purpose that the leaders have thought about. But that doesn't work for two reasons. So number one is that employees are much more likely to embed and practice the purpose if they've had a role in shaping it. And number two, leaders don't have all of the knowledge themselves. It could be that employees have a role. So let me give two examples. So one is going back to Vodafone, right? So there, at the time, as I said, their strategy was focused on the Western Spectrum license auctions. But then seeing the success of M-Pesa, and that was something they just allowed the responsibility department to run with it, they saw the power of mobile technology, and now they've actually changed their purpose statement. It currently is building a digital society that enhances socio-economic progress. So the idea of socio-economic progress was never there in 2007. It was just to increase market share. But once they allowed employees to run with this idea of M-Pesa, they realized the power of that. The second example I like to give is the National Health Service, which is the UK's publicly funded health system. So what they first thought was, let's think about our purpose based on our internal conversations, not just with management, but also doctors. And they came out with a purpose statement of helping people get better and get healthy, which you might think sort of obvious for a health service. But then once they tested it externally with patients and charities and so on, they realized that actually part of the purpose should be a decent death when the time came. So palliative care. And that's surprising because for a service that was so focused on wellness, they might not have realized the importance of actually palliative care and a decent death. And it was only with the external testing that they ended up not missing it. And actually the purpose of the National Health Service is really important because it's enshrined in their constitution. So it's a legally binding purpose. And indeed they are evaluated according to whether they deliver on their purpose. So had the purpose statement had only been about wellness, then they would have not invested a lot of resources in palliative care, even though that's something that many citizens think to be very important.
Excellent. All right. So in addition to being deliberate and focused, you also need to have it be emergent so that your stakeholders, especially the customers, as well as probably employees and so forth, can also help shape how that purpose is developing over time. Thank you, Alex. Moving to how to measure it. So what have you found to be the most effective ways? You've already shared here for a bunch of these things, there are no numbers initially. So how do you go about measurement, and how do you have, like, what are the key metrics or data points that you found to be most helpful to business leaders looking to live accordance to this, in accordance with this philosophy?
So I think the important thing is to think about it being tailored to your company's purpose. So there are various organizations. The World Economic Forum just came out a couple of weeks ago with a list of measures that every company should report. I think that's the wrong approach, right? People like this idea of comparability, but I think what you need to think about is what is the most relevant measures given the purpose that you've stated. So let's take, for example, Trainline. So this is a UK company that you book your train tickets on. So there's a lot of programming and computing there. And so what the leader realized was actually one of the big challenges in our industry is female representation. So in most industries, right, there is a big problem of diversity and inclusion, but this might be particularly severe within coding and programming. And so they have a target of how many female coders that they would like to ensure are part of their workforce by a certain time period. If you are, let's say, Dodler Dairy, right, what you're looking at there is the income uplift that you're providing to your dairy farmers. So just to think about, well, what are the most relevant metrics that we have for our company's purpose? And then I'd say some nuance to that is when you're doing the reporting is to look at the narrative behind the numbers. I know that finance professors like myself love to have loads of faith in numbers, but you have this problem, which I often call hit the target, miss the point. Right, so if you set yourself a target, you could hit it without adhering to the spirit of the target. So let me give an example. So in Japan, there are some companies like Toshiba and Panasonic where people used to make magnetic tape. And those people don't have good jobs anymore because obviously there's no demand for the product. Now, what would be good is if they were unfortunately made redundant to allow them to find jobs elsewhere, and if the company helped them find another job. But that would be bad for their numbers, right? Because in Japan, redundancies are a taboo and they don't want to increase their redundancy numbers. So what they've done is they put these employees in what's known as banishment rooms. So there they sit and watch security footage every day. So that's something which gives no human dignity, that does not provide meaningful work, but it's something which keeps sort of the redundancy numbers down. And so what is important, I think, is for companies not just to know whether you hit the numbers, but why you hit them. Well, we already know with financial numbers, you can do bad things to hit them. You can hit an earnings target by cutting wages, but that's also true with non-financial numbers, right? You can create a lot of jobs, but not provide meaningful work. And so we want to understand the process that we went through to hit the numbers. And also what we'd like is for companies to sometimes miss their numbers, right? So if companies are setting targets for carbon emissions or diversity and so on, right? There's one way you can hit all of your numbers. You set really easy targets. When in fact, I think targets should be so stretching that sometimes you should not miss them. And unfortunately, us as a society, like, we really like to blame companies and call them out if they set a target but not hit them. But I think that's sort of bad, because that would just mean that companies are not going to be ambitious in the targets that they're setting.
Excellent. So importance of stretch goals, importance of having the right narrative. I guess one, like, just quick follow-up on this question is, it's still good to have some examples of, like, what's a go-to metric. So for example, one thing we use a lot for all the different stakeholders is just get them to rate everything 0 to 10 after an experience with us, right? So to what extent would you recommend this experience? And you could ask that question to your employees, to your vendors, to your employees and other stakeholders that you're looking to impact, even if they're not directly on your P&L. Have you seen anything else like that? While I know you said, okay, it's better not to generalize and give everybody comparable metrics to strive towards. It should be tailored to your purpose. But just to get our creative juices flowing here, have you seen, like, any concrete examples like that we might be able to implement in our business of creative metrics?
Yeah, sure. So I think employees are material to almost any business. So employee turnover is obviously one important one. But I think employee turnover, that's more a lagging indicator. What I also like is leading indicators. So how can we predict employee turnover? Because once the employee is left, you can't really do anything about it. So a good leading indicator is absenteeism. So if the employee is not showing up for certain reasons, then that might be highlighting some issues within the firm. So I'd look at something like absenteeism and employee turnover. I might also look at something such as the percentage of senior vacancies which are filled by internal people, because that would also suggest that there is a career progression here rather than there being a lot of external hires. It's also might be demotivating for employees to think, well, there's actually a glass ceiling here because we can only progress a certain amount internally. So that's a good measure. A lot of companies report employee engagement or employee satisfaction scores, and that's just based on a survey. But I think that alone is meaningless. So to tell me your employee satisfaction is 73% doesn't really tell me much. But if you understood what are the areas that you're strong at and what the areas are that you're weak at and what are your concrete plans for improvement, then I think that that number becomes much more meaningful.
All right. Thanks so much, Alex. The fifth and final point you had was around what not to do. Could you share with us any additional details there that business leaders should keep in mind?
Absolutely. I think this is perhaps one of the most important ones, and one of the ones which is often ignored, is that purpose is about as much knowing what not to do as what to do. Because if your purpose really has any bite, you should stop doing some activities that are not consistent with your purpose. So perhaps one of the most famous examples was CVS, the pharmacy. So they renamed themselves CVS Health, and they came up with their purpose, which is putting people on the path to better health. Now, alone, that would just be a nice slogan. But what they said is we're going to stop selling cigarettes, even though at the time that was a $2 million revenue stream. Now, there's another example of Patagonia. So their purpose is we are in business to save our home planet. And what they did was on Black Friday, they took out a few full-page New York Times ad with a picture of their jackets saying, don't buy this jacket. You heard that correct. Don't buy this jacket. Well, you might think Black Friday is when you want to encourage shopping, but they said, no, we're going to launch this Common Threads initiative, which is going to encourage customers to recycle their clothes rather than to buy new ones. And so purpose sometimes would lead you to more seemingly crazy decisions that you could not justify, even with a long-term proper focus. And let me just give you, and you might think these are sort of extreme examples, so let me give you a more modest example. So I think, and I go into this in the end of the book, is how the ideas of purpose can also be applied at the personal level. So I have a personal purpose. For me, it's to use rigorous research to influence the practice of business. So that's why I love doing interviews like this, because I know that I'm speaking to some of the leaders of this world. But in order to do that, I have to accept far fewer invitations to give academic talks, even if it's a prestigious university or a keynote at an academic conference. I'll say no to a lot of those things, because if I didn't say no to that, I would not have time for conversations like these or the research into real world companies that allow me to be informed for conversations such as these.
All right, awesome, Alex. Thank you so much. Now that we've gone through this, my final question to you before jumping into the audience Q&A is how this applies on the one hand at a micro level, at the individual level. What are the key recommendations you've come up with in your book? But also at a very macro level, at a national level, how do we think about this from a national policy perspective? Before you dive in there, everyone participating live over the next 2-3 minutes, if you could type any questions you have for Alex into the Q&A box, we'll do our very best to get through all of them before the top of the hour. So Alex, national and personal implications of everything that you shared today.
Thank you. So let me start with the personal implications first. And so I think there's a lot of really nice analogies between corporate purpose and personal purpose. In particular, personal purpose also has to be focused and targeted. And perhaps my favorite business book of all time is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. So habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. So he says, define for yourself a personal mission statement, and that mission statement needs to be focused and targeted. So for me, it's very much on the academic practitioner interface rather than pure academic research. And then why is that so useful? That helps you in time management, which is his habit 3, which is called First Things First. So this means that in a heartbeat, when I got the invitation from Beri to do this interview, I immediately accepted it. But it also means that I know to turn down many things. Just like for a company, having a clear purpose, which is not all things to all people, helps it with resource allocation and knowing what to prioritize and also where to scale back. So I think that's really important at a personal level, and it's a great example of how to put things into practice. And if I go back to something I mentioned earlier, what's in your hand? I said a company should ask this: what is my expertise and how can I solve problems with that? Vodafone with M-Pesa. I think we can also ask this as individuals. So I know a friend of mine is a partner of a law firm. When the pandemic hit, he asked, well, what is in my hand? Well, the fact that he's financially comfortable meant that he advance purchased 100 coffees from his local coffee shop, and that gave them a huge liquidity lifeline, which allowed them to ride out the pandemic. Or another friend who's sort of middle management at one of the large professional services accountancy firms. Well, many people were furloughed, so they were moved to 4-day a week. And so he said, what is my hand? Is I've got a free day every week, and I'm going to use this to sign up to Spare Hand, which is an organization to connect him with elderly people that he could do grocery shopping for. And so I think to think proactively what we can do with our own resources and expertise is something which unleashes a lot of good.
Beautifully said, Alex. That's really profound. And let's switch gears finally to on the national perspective. So how do we think about this in, like from a national policy, international corporation perspective?
Thank you. I think one thing to think about, there's many levels that we can have this conversation, but I think one thing just to peek at specific would be on trade and the idea of a trade war. So often people think that, well, in a war, if the other person loses, you will automatically win. So when President Trump put in his tariffs, he said, well, these tariffs must be working because the Chinese stock market has fallen over the past 4 months. But China losing doesn't necessarily mean that the US wins, right? It could be that both lose because some mutually beneficial trade is not going to work. And so I think with a lot of these situations, right, we often have this zero-sum mindset that anything that benefits others is going to hurt us, but that's not the case, right? It is true with a balance of payments issue that if somebody is in a current account deficit, then you might be in a surplus. But that is still not recognizing that who benefits from imports. Well, it could be your citizens, right? So why is it that in the UK we are buying Italian wine? Because British wine would be disgusting, right? So we are happy that we can actually import wine from overseas. And then for other imports, right? So it's often companies which are buying these as inputs, and without those affordable inputs, then maybe our companies would not be competitive when they're selling their output. So recognizing that there is a positive sum element. Now, that doesn't mean that there should be unfettered free trade in every single case. So there might be certain cases in which you might want to have some trade policy, but I think we need to first start with the mindset as to what is the mutually beneficial and the pie growing activity that we can do together as different leaders of different countries.
Excellent, Alex. I know quite a few of the other things you said would be another super interesting conversation around countries also defining their strategies on budgets around, okay, well, what is the extra social good we could be doing with what we have in hand, with the same kind of parameters you mentioned, like based on comparative advantage and what multiplies, as well as also deciding what not to be doing specifically as well. So lots more for us to all ponder. And thank you for all your great answers so far. Switching now to the audience questions. The first one is from Brent Gingerich, who asks, what is the quote unquote purpose statement of the NHS, and what are the key metrics the NHS should track to monitor if they're achieving such a purpose? And he says, I believe this is the fundamental issue with the socialized health system in Canada, particularly Ontario. Too many decisions affecting our health sector make good politics, but miss the mark on what the purpose of the system should be.
Thank you. So the purpose, when it was published in the Constitution, which is legally blinding, says the following: the NHS belongs to the people. It is there to improve our health and well-being, supporting us to keep mentally and physically well, to get better when we are ill, and here's the important thing, and when we cannot fully recover, to stay as well as we can to the end of our lives. So that last part was the part which was put in because of the external testing, recognizing the importance of palliative care. So in terms of the key metrics, so that's something I don't know off the top of my head, because here, in order to know understand the NHS, I interviewed a former senior executive from the NHS, and she told me about that process through which the purpose was formed. I have since talked to her and said, well, has this actually mattered in terms of the external testing? And she says, yes, right, the people who are there to hold the NHS accountable are making sure that they're held accountable for those different dimensions, including the palliative care. But I don't know of the specific metric they are using. Right, I know that they are recognizing that that's part of it, but I'm afraid I just don't know off the top of my head what the metric is. But certainly the Constitution is meaningful, and she's confirmed this to me, in that when they are evaluated, they will try to look at all of those dimensions of the Constitution.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. Next question is from Georgios Vitagianis. He asks, can you give a practical action plan that leads to a clear understanding of purpose and to high employee engagement so that the purpose is fully embedded?
Yes, thanks. So I think the first thing is start with just the definition of a clear purpose. And so the more focused and targeted the purpose is, the more valuable it is, because it's something which is most likely to be translated down to the rest of the organization. So again, to say my purpose is to serve all of these things, right, there's a lot of confusion there. Then I think to think about, well, what are the metrics that we are going to be tracking in order to try to see, well, are we truly delivering on the purpose? So I gave some examples from Trainline and Dodler Dairy. And I think also what's important is for executives, in terms of their own pay structures, for those pay structures to be linked to long-term performance. Because if you come up with some great purpose statements, but you know that the CEO is still going to be paid according to quarterly earnings, you're going to have a lot of doubt as to whether this is going to be put into practice. And this could also lead to changes in the reward structures down the organization. So there's one professional services firm which invited me to speak at one of their offsites on purpose, and they told me that their key metric still remained profit per partner. So that's a problem, because it means that the managing partner can say all that he wanted to, but then when the rubber hits the road, right, people are still managing to short-term profit. So if it is indeed the case that we're going to be looking at some other metrics, like my former employer, Morgan Stanley, you can see I'm wearing still their fleece, is that even as a junior employee, they looked at things such as sensitivity to support staff. That affected the evaluation, and that also affected the reward structure. So to make sure that what is measured and what is monitored, what is rewarded, is aligned with the purpose. And so this makes sure that it doesn't just stay as a nice statement, it's something which is going to be affecting daily decisions.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. A quick follow-up on a related topic here from Armando Beltran, who asks, in your opinion, should the purpose be drafted by the shareholders, the CEO, or should it come from all the associates, bottom up, or at least all having a say? Interested in hearing your thoughts around that.
Yeah, so this is important, and I'm afraid I'm going to give a little bit of the professor's answer as a little bit of all, but let me now add a little bit of structure to that, so it seemed not as completely fence sitting. So certainly, right, the purpose should have the CEO and the board there, and it's important for the board, not just the executive team, to understand the importance of purpose, because it's the board who's assessing the CEO. And so if the board is not buying into the purpose, then the CEO might have a great purpose statement, but just worry about profit, because profit is what they're going to be evaluated against. So I know some board directors in the UK who say they do not let the executive team present a major capital expenditure or restructuring or strategic plan to the board unless they explain how is it consistent with the firm's purpose. So it's not just an NPV analysis, there's also purpose analysis behind it. There are some organizations like EQT Ventures where the entire purpose statement is signed by the board. So I think board and CEO should be part of this, but also part might be consultations within employees. So there are organizations like McKinsey and the Disney Institute which will run formal workshops with employees to try to get them to understand to try to get them to contribute what they think the purpose should be. But I do think I like your mention, Amanda, of shareholders. And this is really important because I think you should have shareholder buy-in. So one of the key pushbacks to the Business Roundtable statement was that a lot of CEOs signed this without either running it past their board, 2% run it past their board, and without consulting their anchor shareholders. And this is really important because there is some evidence that unfortunately some CEOs end up supporting the social causes which are just their pet causes. And there's even some research showing that CEOs donate to charity where the remuneration committee members are also on that charity. And so in return for donating to the charity that your REMCO is on, right, they pay you more. So instead, what we want to make sure is that the social causes that we support are also supported by shareholders. So one thing that I introduce in the book in chapter 9, and also I just started to draft an op-ed about this, which will hopefully send to some newspapers, is the idea of say on purpose. So how does that work? Well, at the moment, there's say on pay, where companies put their pay to an investor vote. But I'd say even more important than pay is a company's purpose. And so this would make sure that investors have buy-in. And then this gives managers confidence that they can make some of these difficult trade-offs. If my investors have told me that they have approved the fact that I'm going to spend some money and reduce my long-term shareholder value in order to reduce our carbon footprint, then this gives me the confidence that this actually has the shareholder approval of that. So I think that it is important to have shareholder buy-in, because once you do that, then you are knowing that you can put the purpose into practice without fear of shareholders getting upset and voting for your dismissal because you've not maximized the short-term stock price.
Thank you, Alex. Next one is from Michael Levinson, who asks, what are some tangible and measurable outcomes that stakeholders are looking to see from social impact or purpose-driven initiatives? Could you give an example?
Yeah, so this will obviously depend from industry to industry, but let's take, say, the banking industry, because why I look at them is they were often seen as sort of being the enemies because they contributed to the financial crisis, but now they're taking purpose very seriously. So one thing here could be financial inclusion. So what are the percentage of people who are now getting loans or mortgages which fall into particular income brackets or demographic characteristics? So there, that would be something with a tangible outcome. If you think about, say, a food company, so Nestle, they for a long time have been trying to reduce the number of calories that they have in terms of some of their more indulgent food ranges. They also, I think, internally track a measure which is revenues per calorie, right? So there, obviously that measure improves either if you increase the price, but also if you do reduce the calories that you are having in your food items. And so that's something which is also something that stakeholders care about, right? Because of the importance of obesity. And certainly for me as a shareholder, I don't want to be making my money if I was a shareholder in this company by contributing to global obesity. So those are examples where there are two quite different ones, which are different for different industries, but it does have to be that the tangible and measurable outcomes have to be specific to that industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. One final audience question from Ross Bernson. He says, there's significant momentum behind power paradigm in our society right now. How do you confront this dynamic successfully when you're trying to evoke a grow the pie paradigm within our companies?
And Beri, I know that you didn't ask the question, but do you know what he means by power paradigm? So I'm guessing what I think he means, but just you might know this phrase a bit more.
Yeah, well,
or if Ross could put it in the chat.
I would also be, yeah, Ross, if you're here, feel free to put it in the chat. Otherwise, my guess is around, the whole thing around like, the 1% controlling a lot of things, and it's like at the expense of the 99%. How do you approach those like power dynamic type conversations?
Yeah, so that was my inference, is that the power paradigm might be that actually, if you're a business leader, right, you can just do what you want because you've got a lot of power. And there's large corporations right now where, because of monopoly power, right, this is something where they don't need to consider the other aspects. So what I'm trying to highlight is actually it's just good business to think about wider society. So even if you don't have to, because you're in such a strong, powerful position, right, it is actually benefiting you in order to take your stakeholders seriously. So I see Ross has now put into the chat some of the social justice movements. So maybe, let's say in the past, let's say sports, there was a lot of racism where sports teams would not hire black players, and maybe they could have got away with that at the time, but it was actually the first sports teams to recruit black players that were able to outperform because they were recruiting a segment of the labor force which was not really which was really being looked down upon. And that could be the same for females or people of socioeconomic backgrounds. Is that why we're thinking about purpose is not just because we have a moral obligation and because it's worthy. It absolutely is those things, but it's actually just good business sense to recognize the importance of your stakeholders, the fact that if you're taking them seriously, not only is their slice of the pie growing, but also your slice of the pie is growing because they're becoming more motivated and more productive. And I think part of this is just the importance of the evidence showing that this is not just a wishful thinking. So that's why, if your question is, how do you confront this dynamic successfully? I, as a professor, would say, well, let's look at the evidence, because in the absence of evidence, it could just be something which sounds too good to be true.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex, for all of your answers. My very final question for you is, how can our community best support you and your endeavors? How can we best engage with you or spread the word about this growth the pie mentality? And if you have a final word of wisdom to share also at the end, or a call to action, we'd love to hear it. My final call to action to everybody who's participating before Alex shares his thoughts is, Alex gave us some really profound frameworks for how we can better think about our purpose, both as companies, but also as individuals, and how to better integrate this grow the pie mindset. So would encourage everybody at the end of this call to just take a minute or two to write, what's one key change I could make based on what Alex said today? So without further ado, Alex, would love to hear, how can we best support you? And a final word of wisdom.
Really appreciate you giving me that opportunity, Barry. I would just say, just spread the word here. So this idea of purpose being not just worthy but commercial is really important, and that's indeed why I wrote the book. So sort of the economics of writing a book are not really attractive at all, but why I wanted to write that book is to show that actually a purposeful business is good business, and this is based on a lot of evidence. And I also wanted the book to be more central, because you have some people who strongly defend shareholder value and others who say companies should be really heavily regulated. And both of those views get a lot of support because they're polarizing. But I think this middle way is a way that's practical. So to the extent to which you can share the message and share the book, if you think that it's something which provides the message that resonates with you, I'd really appreciate that, because often if you are the more central ground, your voice tends to get shouted down by people on the extreme ends. And then I say, in terms of a practical application, I would just ask yourself the question, what is in my hand? So I know that most people here are business leaders. So what is in my hand as a business? What are my company's resources and expertise? And how can I think creatively about how to deploy them to solve social problems? And then similarly, as a person, to ask, well, what is in my hand as an individual, and how can I use my own talents and passions to serve society? And I think once we have this idea as to what we can do with the resources and knowledge that we have, I think we can achieve far more as a society than what we've achieved in the past.
Absolutely, Alex. I can genuinely say you are changing the world with your work. You're helping us have the lenses and the frameworks to better optimize what we do, better navigate like a very uncertain world out there. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. And thank you for joining us for this hour. We loved it. I loved it. On behalf of everyone, I just want to thank you, wish you the very best, and hope to see you again very, very soon.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this myself. And thank you so much, everybody, joining. I know there's lots going on in the world right now, so thanks for giving up an hour. And I'm also cognizant that there were some questions we just didn't get time to answer. So if you'd like to just drop me a LinkedIn message, I'll commit to answering any question that people pose, which we didn't have time to get through today. So thank you so much for the engagement, which made it a lot of fun from my end as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. See you again very soon. And thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. See you all again soon.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Take care.